Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're pulling you into a story of just a singular American transformation. It's a journey that starts not just in poverty, but in a place with almost zero formal opportunity.
That's right.
We're doing a deep dive into the sources that detail the life of Abraham Lincoln.
And it really is the ultimate study in how character is forged by adversity, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're not just, recounting the political wins of the 16th president.
No.
Our mission here is to synthesize those key moments of struggle, of self-education, and the political combat that really sculpted him into the leader he became. The only leader, arguably, who could have navigated the country's deepest crisis.
Exactly. The goal here is to get at that paradox.
Yeah.
How does a man who grew up in the most unforgiving environment imaginable, where just surviving was the goal of the day,
Right.
how does that man develop the intellectual rigor and the unshakable integrity to not only save a nation, but to fundamentally redefine what American freedom even means?
And we are diving into a really comprehensive historical narrative. So we need to focus on the political climate of the 1850s, which was just toxic. We have to look at the legal complexities he mastered all on his own, and just the extraordinary demands placed on his integrity during the war. It's a story of personal growth set against, national collapse.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Let's start at the very beginning, because you really can't understand the man without understanding the world that made him. So let's set the scene. It's February 12th, 1809. When we talk about Lincoln's origins, they were about as humble as you can possibly get. We're in a tiny, one-room log cabin near what is now Hodgenville, Kentucky.
And we really have to be clear about what cabin meant on the frontier.
Yeah.
This isn't some rustic vacation home.
No.
We're talking about a structure built from logs, probably not even chinked properly, maybe 12 by 18 feet. And you'd have 5-6 people living inside.
In the middle of winter?
Exactly. Deep winter when he was born.
The sources really emphasize the complete lack of, anything. There was no glass for the windows, just openings you'd cover with animal skins.
And the floor.
Packed dirt. Just dirt. This was a constant, relentless battle against the cold, against sickness, against hunger.
A daily struggle. And his family's poverty was just persistent.
Yeah.
His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and a carpenter, but he was always struggling, always trying to get a solid footing with land claims, trying to find some economic stability.
Which is why they moved so much. They were constantly chasing a better opportunity that never quite materialized.
So with all that instability, what was the foundation for young Abraham?
Well, it really came down to his moral training. And that's where his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, becomes so important. By all accounts, despite all the hardships, she was known for her kindness. And she instilled in him this powerful, simple value of honesty. That was the bedrock. It's the ethical foundation that his entire political and legal identity was later built on. But even that small bit of stability was shattered pretty early on. When Abraham was just 9 years old, his mother died.
She died of milk sickness. It was tragically common back then. It was caused by drinking milk from a cow that had eaten a toxic plant, white snake root.
And the impact on a 9-year-old boy.
Devastating. Beyond the obvious emotional loss, the sources confirm he was basically thrust into a world of forced independence, this kind of profound early suffering. It can create bitterness, or it can create this intense capacity for empathy.
And in Lincoln's case,
It was clearly the latter. It seemed to have reinforced his natural resilience, his independence. He had to grow up fast.
it's easy to just focus on that pain, but this is where we see the really remarkable part of his youth emerge, right? This incredible hunger for knowledge.
It's staggering, actually. The statistics are just unbelievable. Lincoln himself said he had less than a single year of formal schooling in his entire life.
A year combined.
Combined. And it wasn't even a solid year. It was a few weeks here, a few weeks there, with teachers who were just passing through. For the man who would become one of the greatest writers and speakers in American history, it's almost impossible to process.
So this is where the listener who values learning really connects. He didn't have a school, so he just made his own.
He literally built his own curriculum. He would walk for miles, we're told, to borrow books from neighbors.
And these weren't simple books.
No, classics, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, histories of George Washington, and then famously, he'd read them by the flickering light of the fireplace. He'd meticulously copy down passages he wanted to remember onto a wooden shovel or a board because paper was just too scarce.
That discipline is incredible.
It's the methodical nature of it that's so fascinating. This wasn't just reading for fun. He was actively teaching himself grammar, rhetoric, how to structure an argument.
And later, law.
Yes, absorbing incredibly complex legal texts, like Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, the foundation of common law, all on his own. That practice of absorbing, analyzing, and then distilling complex ideas, that became the hallmark of his speeches.
It's such a powerful lesson, isn't it? That you can generate intellectual capital through sheer personal effort, even when the system gives you nothing.
Absolutely nothing. And all of this intense mental work was happening while his body was engaged in just punishing physical labor.
Right. The family eventually moves to Southern Illinois.
And this is where he gets that famous nickname, the Rail Splitter. He was known for his physical strength, his incredible work ethic. He split thousands upon thousands of logs to build fences. This identity, the hardworking common man, it wasn't a political invention. It was his actual life.
And that nickname becomes this powerful political symbol for him decades later.
A hugely powerful symbol. It set him apart from the polished elite politicians in Washington. It screamed authenticity and grit. He was one of them.
So as he moves out of that world of pure physical labor, we get to what might be the single most defining event of his moral and political awakening.
The trip to New Orleans.
Yeah. He's about 19, and he takes a job on a flatboat ferrying goods down the Mississippi River.
And you have to imagine this. He's a young man raised in the rugged, poor, but free environments of Indiana and Illinois. And this journey takes him into the absolute heart of the Deep South.
And for the first time, he sees it.
He sees a slave market. He sees human beings, men, women, children being inspected like livestock, chained, sold off. It's not an abstract political idea for him anymore. It's this visceral, horrifying reality right in front of him.
The sources say it broke his heart.
Yes, and that it planted a deep hatred of slavery in his mind that he never, ever forgot. I think you can draw a straight line from that moment in New Orleans to the Emancipation Proclamation. That was the moral pivot.
So he carries this with him as he starts to build his own career. He works as a store clerk, a postmaster, a surveyor.
Before finally dedicating himself completely to the law.
And it's as a lawyer, riding the circuit in Illinois, that he really builds his reputation. This is where Honest Abe comes from.
Exactly. And it's important to understand, this wasn't just a gimmick. It wasn't just about not telling lies. It was about his professional ethics. He became known for refusing to take cases he thought were morally wrong, even if they were easy wins.
There are stories of him actually advising clients not to sue, right? Telling them to settle or just drop it because the case was based on malice.
Yeah, urging them to find a compromise. His view was that the law should serve justice, not just technicalities. So this combination of, self-taught legal mastery and this unwavering ethical core gave him immense credibility later on.
And he was going to need it because by the 1850s, the national political landscape was just coming apart at the seams.
It was in genuine peril. The division over slavery had festered for decades, and now was becoming an existential threat. The old compromises just weren't working anymore.
His own political party, the Whigs, was literally disintegrating over it.
Right. And the core issue wasn't even just slavery where it already was. It was about whether slavery would be allowed to expand into the new Western territories.
You had the North, which was increasingly unified in wanting to stop the spread, believing it would eventually die out if contained.
And then you had the South, becoming more and more aggressive, demanding federal protection for slavery as a right, the right to take their property, meaning enslaved people, anywhere in the country.
So you have these two completely incompatible systems, a free labor economy and a slave labor economy, trying to coexist under one government. It just wasn't sustainable. And this national emergency is what really yanks Lincoln back into politics after he'd taken a bit of a break. He saw the very foundation of the country starting to crumble.
His specific trigger was Senator Stephen Douglas in 1854. Douglas pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act,
which introduced popular sovereignty.
Exactly. The idea that settlers in a new territory could vote on whether to allow slavery. For Lincoln, this was a profound moral and political retreat. It effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise and opened up vast new lands to the possibility of enslavement.
And that puts him on a collision course with Douglas, leading to one of the greatest showdowns in American political history.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858.
Yeah. And these weren't just typical political debates, were they?
Not at all. They were deep philosophical battles for the soul of the nation. Douglas argued for pragmatism, for democracy. Let the local people decide.
But Lincoln countered with morality.
He countered with a moral argument rooted in the Declaration of Independence. He argued that slavery was a fundamental wrong, and the federal government had a duty to contain it, to put it on a course for ultimate extinction, regardless of what a local majority might want.
He ends up losing that Senate race.
Yeah, he loses the election, yes, but in a way, he wins the war. The debates elevate him from a well-respected Illinois lawyer to a national figure. He becomes a leading voice for the new Republican Party, which was formed almost entirely on that single idea, stopping the expansion of slavery.
But just as they're building this platform, the Supreme Court drops a bombshell.
Oh, the Dred Scott decision in 1857. It was an absolute catastrophe for the anti-slavery movement. Chief Justice Roger Taney's ruling had three just devastating points.
Okay, let's break them down.
First, he ruled that no person of African descent, whether they were enslaved or free, could ever be a U.S. citizen.
So they had no rights in federal court.
None. Second, he declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional, saying Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. And third, flowing from that, slaveholders had a constitutional right to take their enslaved people anywhere.
It essentially legalized slavery everywhere in the country.
It did. It rendered Lincoln's entire political goal of containment almost legally impossible. The atmosphere became absolutely toxic.
And it's in that environment that Lincoln gives perhaps his most famous speech before he's even president.
The House Divided Speech, June 1858, and it was seen as incredibly radical at the time.
He says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free."
And that wasn't just a clever phrase. It was a direct challenge to the 70 years of compromise that had held the Union together. He was saying the time for ambiguity is over.
The country had to choose. It would become all one thing or all the other.
Exactly. It framed the whole struggle as existential. It was a fight for the nation's identity. And that clarity, that diagnosis of the problem, is what propelled him toward the presidency in 1860.
An election that was itself a perfect reflection of how fragmented the country had become.
A four-way race. You had Lincoln for the Republicans, Douglas for the Northern Democrats, Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and another guy, John Bell. The opposition couldn't even unite against him.
And Lincoln wins.
He wins with only about 40% of the popular vote, and without winning a single Southern state.
Which was all the excuse the South needed.
It was immediate. South Carolina seceded in December 1860 before Lincoln was even inaugurated. The sitting president, James Buchanan, basically did nothing.
So by the time Lincoln actually takes the oath of office in March 1861,
7 states had already left and formed their own country, the Confederate States of America. The Civil War was at that point essentially unavoidable.
the first shots are fired on April 12th, 1861 at Fort Sumter.
And Lincoln's prophecy came true. The House was divided. The war had begun. And the weight of saving it all fell squarely on the shoulders of the self-taught lawyer from the frontier.
So Lincoln becomes president, and he's immediately a wartime commander-in-chief, it's a profoundly unlikely role for him, isn't it? He had very little military experience.
Almost none. He'd served for a very brief time in the Black Hawk War decades earlier, but he had no formal training in military strategy. And suddenly, he's commanding the largest army ever assembled on the continent in the bloodiest war the nation would ever see.
His first days in Washington must have been just utter chaos.
Complete chaos. But he did something brilliant right away. He assembled what's now famously known as the team of rivals.
So he brings the very men who ran against him for the nomination into his cabinet.
That's right. William Seward, Salmon P. Chase, Edwin Stanton. These were powerful, ambitious men who, frankly, thought they were better qualified for the job than he was.
That seems like a recipe for disaster. Why would he do that?
It speaks volumes about his confidence and his leadership. He knew they were the most capable minds in the country. He put the success of the nation above his own ego or any need for personal loyalty. He was willing to manage their egos and their criticisms to get the best result.
And his leadership was tested immediately with a string of just awful military defeats in the East.
Crushing defeats. He went through a series of generals, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, who were either too cautious, incompetent, or both.
Yet he never gave up.
That's the key. That resilience, forged in his childhood, was what held the Union cause together in those dark early years. He never stopped working. He was constantly reading books on military strategy, sending telegrams to his generals, trying to understand the situation on the ground.
And he's also facing huge challenges on the political and constitutional front. he takes some pretty radical actions, like suspending habeas corpus.
A really crucial point. He suspended the right of a person under arrest to be brought before a judge. He imposed a military draft. He seized control of telegraph lines.
Actions that his critics labeled as tyrannical.
They called him a dictator. But Lincoln's argument was simple. His oath was to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And how could he do that if he let the entire government collapse because he was afraid to take necessary, if controversial, actions to save it?
And amidst all this chaos, military losses, political attacks, he pulls off the single most transformative act of his presidency.
The Emancipation Proclamation.
Which he issues in 1863.
Yes, and it was a masterpiece of political and military strategy. First, he waited for a Union victory, a bloody and tenuous one at Antietam, so he could issue it from a position of strength, not desperation.
And constitutionally, he frames it as a war measure.
Precisely. He uses his power as commander-in-chief. He's not just freeing people out of pure moral principle, legally speaking. He is seizing the property, the enslaved people, of those in active rebellion against the United States in order to weaken the Confederacy's ability to wage war.
And this is where the nuance is so important. It didn't free all the slaves.
No, it didn't. It only applied to the states that were currently in rebellion. The slaves in the loyal border states, like Kentucky and Maryland, were not freed by the proclamation.
A political calculation to keep those states in the Union.
An absolutely necessary one. If those states had seceded, the Union war effort might have collapsed. But the moral impact was undeniable. From that moment on, the war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now explicitly about freedom.
And that changed everything on the world stage.
It did. It galvanized Black Americans to enlist in the Union Army in huge numbers. And it critically prevented European powers like Britain and France, which were anti-slavery, from ever recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation.
It was a moral and diplomatic victory. And just a few months later, he uses his words again to redefine the entire purpose of the war.
At Gettysburg.
The dedication of the National Cemetery there.
Yes, on this battlefield that was still reeling from the bloodiest battle of the war. His speech was shockingly short, just 10 sentences, 2 minutes.
But maybe the most famous speech in American history.
Because of its perfection. He doesn't talk about the victory or the generals. He talks about the nation's purpose. He connects the sacrifice of those soldiers all the way back to 1776.
And that immortal phrase, a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
It was a refounding. He argues that the war is a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal can survive. He retroactively defines the entire brutal conflict as a struggle for equality and democracy itself.
So after 4 long years, the war finally comes to an end in April 1865.
The Union wins. The country is saved. But Lincoln's final essential task was already in motion.
The 13th Amendment.
Yes. He knew the Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure that could be challenged in court later, so he pushed tirelessly to get the 13th Amendment passed by Congress, which abolished slavery everywhere in the United States forever.
It passed just months before the war ended.
Securing the most monumental legal and moral change in American history. It was the culmination of his life's work. The Union was preserved, and the promise of liberty was, at last, expanded.
It's just such a profound tragedy that this incredible story of survival and ultimate triumph ends so abruptly, so devastatingly.
5 days.
Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, with the work of healing the nation just beginning, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater.
He was shot on April 14, 1865, by a Confederate sympathizer, an actor named John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln died the next morning.
And the nation, which he had just held together through sheer force of will, just plunged into mourning.
The grief was immense. The funeral train that carried his body back to Illinois was met by millions of people, black and white, lining the tracks to pay their respects. It was a reflection of this profound sense of loss. He had endured so much, only to be killed at the very moment of victory.
When you look back, the whole arc of his life is just astonishing.
It's almost unbelievable. To rise from the absolute destitution of that log cabin, to navigate a political world of elites who looked down on him, and to become the one person who could hold the country together.
He didn't just save the Union. He forced it to confront its original sin and live up to the promise of its founding.
He showed that ambition, when it's fused with that unshakable moral core, with that honest Abe integrity, can overcome anything. His entire leadership was built on the knowledge he fought for, reading by firelight as a boy.
That process of self-creation is really the enduring lesson.
It is. It reminds us that critical thinking, that deep knowledge, can be forged independently, outside of any formal system.
Which really leaves us with this final thought for you, the listener, to take away from this. Given Lincoln's absolute commitment to independent learning, teaching himself law, grammar, history, everything, under the worst possible circumstances, how does that fundamental self-driven ability to seek and grasp truth become the ultimate non-negotiable foundation for real moral and political leadership?
And what does that mean for us today in a world where information is so easily delivered, but knowledge, true knowledge, might not be as independently forged? A powerful thought.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we cut through the noise and deliver the essential nuggets of knowledge you need to be genuinely well-informed.
That's right. And today we are zeroing in on Abraham Lincoln. But, not in the way you might expect.
Exactly. Instead of just another chronological biography, our mission today is to distill the core vocabulary, the defining concepts that really shaped his character and, of course, the devastating crisis he inherited.
It's all about the language. We've synthesized a body of sources that focus specifically on the words with the most weight. We think it's a kind of intellectual shortcut to understanding the man.
A shortcut, yeah, but a deep one. We're talking about the vocabulary of integrity, the rhetoric of political crisis, all of it. The goal for you, the listener, is to move beyond just dates and names.
We want you to really grasp the profound meaning behind terms like frontier, integrity, secede, and emancipation.
Because once you get the implication of those words, you have a complete toolkit for really analyzing his presidency. So let's unpack this, I think. If we want to understand the monumental decisions he made later, we have to start at the absolute beginning.
You have to.
What were the foundational concepts that shaped his character? I mean, the raw materials of the man before he ever even set foot in the Capitol.
To understand Lincoln the man, you absolutely have to start with the environment that forged him. And that foundational concept, that word, is the frontier.
The frontier. It's a word that sounds almost mythological to us today, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds, romanticized. But the sources make it crystal clear this was a harsh, physical, brutal reality.
So what are we actually defining here when we say frontier?
We mean the literal edge of settled land, the border, the line between what they considered civilization and just.
Yeah.
The wild, undeveloped country.
And the immediate implications of that, of living there, must have been profound.
Oh, absolutely. When we talk about Lincoln growing up on the Indiana and Kentucky frontier, we are not talking about quaint villages with a general store. We're talking about genuine, rough isolation. Think about what that means. Very few established roads, a minimal government presence, if any.
And the law was probably just whatever you could enforce yourself.
That's it, exactly. That immediately establishes this necessary precondition for character development, which is just radical self-reliance.
Right. Because there's no system to fall back on. No centralized authority, no functioning bank, no established marketplace.
Every single decision is a matter of pure necessity and survival.
Let's talk about the economic side of that for a second.
Sure. Currency was incredibly scarce, so most transactions were bartering. It was all about trading. If you needed something, you had to build it, or you had to hunt it, or you had to trade for it with something you'd built or hunted.
Every other way.
None. The sources really emphasize that this environment just demanded rugged individualism. You couldn't rely on systems. You relied on your own muscle and your own wit.
And I think this is where Lincoln learned to measure a person.
Right.
Right? Not by their family name or their pedigree.
No, not at all. But by their practical contribution. And crucially, by their word.
That connection feels so critical. That rough, unforgiving environment almost demanded honesty, just as a matter of practicality.
It's true. Dishonesty was inefficient. It was dangerous.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you went back on a deal, if you reneged on your word, you might literally freeze or starve because trust was the only collateral you had.
Your reputation was everything.
It was your currency. So this setting, this physical pressure cooker of the frontier, it makes the sophisticated moral principle he later embodied make perfect sense. It wasn't an abstract idea for him.
It was a survival mechanism that he internalized.
Precisely. It sets the stage for the moral principle that would come to define him, which brings us right to our next term, integrity.
And that enduring nickname, Honest Abe.
Honest Abe.
Integrity is a word that gets tossed around so much in politics, it's almost lost its meaning. But we're talking about the capital I definition here.
We are. The quality of being honest and adhering to strong moral principles. But the real insight, I think, from the material is that little addendum,
Doing the right thing.
even when no one is watching.
That's the whole distinction, isn't it? That's the heart of the matter.
It is.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to be honest when the law is right there or when social pressure dictates it. But true integrity is internal. It's that unwavering commitment to principle, regardless of whether it's politically expedient or personally costly.
Or whether anyone will ever even know.
Right. And this is exactly why the nickname Honest to Abe became so indelible. It wasn't a marketing campaign.
No, the sources are full of these anecdotes from his early life. Him as a clerk, as a circuit lawyer.
The famous one is him reportedly walking for miles just to correct a tiny financial error, a matter of a few cents, with a customer.
You just don't see that. And he earned that name through, well, painstaking repetition of that principle over and over again.
And it's so crucial to see his integrity not just as some personal virtue, but as a source of immense political power.
Okay, unpack that. How does being honest translate to political power?
Well, you have to look at the context. He was operating in Illinois politics during the 1830s, the 40s, and this was an era. It was often defined by backroom deals, corruption, rapidly shifting allegiances.
Standard politics, you might say?
Pretty much. But Lincoln's reputation for trustworthiness was unique. It was almost revolutionary. When Lincoln spoke, people knew, or at least they believed, that he was saying what he actually thought.
Which gave his arguments a different kind of weight.
Exponentially more weight than his rivals, who were, known for their expediency.
Yeah.
His political strength wasn't just in the logic of his arguments, it was the credibility he'd built brick by brick back on the frontier.
Well, your word was your survival.
He carried that same commitment to principle into a world that was defined by compromise and, frankly, by deceit.
So if we connect this all back, the lack of established institutions on the frontier forced him to build his own internal moral institution. He had to build it inside himself.
Exactly. And that moral institution wasn't built in a fancy university lecture hall.
No.
Which brings us to the third foundational concept from his early life, and I think maybe the most inspiring one for us today: self-education.
I think this is where anyone listening, especially anyone who uses this deep dive as a way to, quickly get up to speed on things, should really pay close attention.
Mm-hmm.
The material provides a genuinely shocking fact.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that Lincoln went to school for less than 1 year total in his entire life.
It's almost unbelievable. Less than 1 year. For a man who had become one of the greatest legal minds and, without question, one of the most eloquent writers in American history.
It completely reframes the narrative that, formal institutions, Ivy League schools, are the only path to intellectual greatness.
It really does.
So what did this self-education actually look like? What did it entail? The definition our sources give is specific.
Right. It's teaching oneself by reading, asking questions, and practicing. It's an active process.
He didn't just passively consume information. He actively wrestled with it.
And we can actually dive into his reading list, which is fascinating. It reveals the architecture of his mind. He didn't have access to a vast library, so he had to be selective.
He focused on foundational texts that demanded rigor.
He famously mastered the first 6 books of Euclid's Elements of Geometry.
Geometry, which seems odd. Why geometry for a future lawyer and politician?
Because he sought to understand the nature of proof. Logical, irrefutable proof. He wanted to ensure that every single political or legal argument he made was built upon premises that were unshakable, and that led, step by logical step, to his conclusion.
So his speeches weren't just emotional appeals.
No, not at all. They were often structured like mathematical proofs, almost like a syllogism. He'd lay out premise A, then premise B, and conclude, therefore C must be true.
And that logical rigor, developed by studying Euclid on his own, by candlelight, became a hallmark of his entire political style.
But that's only half of the equation, right? The logic is the skeleton.
So what's the other half?
He also voraciously read Shakespeare and the King James Bible. This is what gave him the poetic depth, the rhetorical power to cloak his geometric arguments in compelling, memorable, powerful language.
So it's the intersection of the two.
It's the combination. When you read something like the Gettysburg Address, you see the logical structure of Euclid, but it's delivered with the elevated poetry of Shakespeare. Self-education for him was about building both logic and language side by side.
It's such a powerful lesson in intellectual perseverance.
Yeah.
And the concept is so relevant to our audience because, you listening right now are engaging in this very same process.
That's a great point. You're seeking out complex knowledge, you're listening to discussions, practicing analysis, you're actively building your own intellectual architecture outside the formal confines of a classroom.
And what did that require of him? What does it require of us?
The material stresses that this pursuit requires intense curiosity and, maybe just as importantly, humility.
The humility to ask questions.
To recognize the gaps in your own knowledge and to commit to the hard work of practice. Lincoln didn't just read law books. He traveled the court circuit, debating complex issues day in and day out, honing his skills against seasoned professionals.
He was stress testing his own education in the real world.
All the time. So his character, forged by the necessity of the frontier, defined by this core of integrity, and sharpened by this active self-education, that was the only thing that could have possibly prepared him for the national cataclysm that was about to unfold.
And what a cataclysm it was. We have to shift gears now. From the making of the man to the massive existential crisis that shattered the nation he was just elected to lead.
A true trial by fire.
The crisis, of course, was the threat of the country literally disintegrating. And the vocabulary of that fracture starts with the ultimate political betrayal, the term secede.
Secede, spelled S-E-C-E-E.
And the simple definition is?
To officially leave or break away from an organization or a country. But, oh my, the political and legal baggage attached to that word in 1860 is just immense.
It's everything. The decision of the Southern states to secede was the foundational political action of the Civil War.
It was the starting gun.
And it wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a constitutional and philosophical rejection of the entire idea of a unified country.
Right. We have to look at the specific context. The Southern states chose to secede because they fundamentally disagreed with the federal government's direction, specifically on the issue of slavery and the balance of power. They demanded the right to form their own nation.
A nation based on their own social and economic systems.
Correct. And to understand the weight of the word secede, you have to look at the philosophical justification they used. They didn't just say, we're leaving.
No, they had a whole legal theory behind it.
They did. They relied heavily on the concept of states' rights and a theory known as the compact theory of the Union.
The compact theory. What does that mean?
The argument was that the United States Constitution was not a binding, permanent document created by the people, but was merely a compact between sovereign, independent states.
Okay, so it's like a business agreement.
In a way, yes. And their argument was, if one party feels the contract is being broken, or if the contract is no longer serving its purpose, that state retains the sovereign right to simply withdraw, to secede.
Which directly contradicted the Northern argument, the one Lincoln championed.
Completely. Lincoln's view was that the Union was perpetual. It was established by the people, not just by the states, and that once you're in, you're in. The nation was a permanent entity.
So from his perspective, secession wasn't just a political withdrawal.
It was an act of rebellion, an act of treason against the constitutional order itself. This is such a critical distinction.
Why?
Because Lincoln viewed secession as pure anarchy. Think it through. If any state can just unilaterally leave whenever it disagrees with a federal policy, say a tax or a bill about roads,
The very concept of a United States is meaningless.
it's gone. The whole project is over. That frontier concept we talked about, the rugged individual building a new civilization, was now being threatened by this internal fracture. Secession was the ultimate reversal of that national drive toward expansion and unity.
This action, this fracture, it led directly to Lincoln articulating one of the most, I think, brilliant and chilling warnings in American history.
It really is.
Which brings us to this powerful metaphor of national collapse.
Yeah.
A house divided against itself cannot stand.
This phrase is from a speech he gave back in 1858. He wasn't even president yet. It was during his campaign against Stephen Douglas for the Illinois Senate seat.
It was controversial at the time, wasn't it?
Oh, intensely controversial. Because it refused to compromise. It drew a hard line. And what's fascinating is that he was directly channeling the Bible, using a metaphor that everyone in his audience would have immediately recognized to describe this existential threat.
And his self-educated wisdom is on full display here. He's not just talking about politics. He's defining the irrepressible nature of the conflict.
Right. He was using the metaphor of a house to refer to the country, to the United States, and arguing that it was structurally incapable of long-term survival under the current conditions.
We have to analyze the depth of that metaphor. He's not just saying people are disagreeing.
No, it's much deeper. A literal house can withstand a few arguments among the people inside it. But Lincoln's point was that the very foundations of the American house were rotten.
Because half the house was built on one principle.
The idea of human enslavement, and the other half was built upon a completely contradictory principle, the idea of free labor and eventually universal human rights. These two systems were fundamentally incompatible. They couldn't coexist in the same structure forever.
So the core meaning is just stark. If the nation remains perpetually half slave and half free, the internal conflict, the fighting, will eventually lead to collapse.
One way or another. He wasn't necessarily predicting a war, but he was predicting a necessary endpoint. The country would either become all one thing, or it would become nothing. The division itself could not hold.
And his critics, like Douglas, they attacked him for this.
They called him a radical, a warmonger. They believed the country could survive indefinitely with these differences through compromises like popular sovereignty.
But Lincoln, with that geometric logic we talked about,
With that Euclidean clarity, yes. He insisted that the arrangement was fundamentally unstable. The dividing force of slavery would either expand or be contained. It couldn't just stay static forever.
so if we pull this section together, the political act of secede was the physical manifestation. It was the crack in the foundation that he had already predicted with the house divided metaphor.
Secession was the proof. It confirmed his prophecy, and now the stakes were defined. Resolving this division was going to require a massive, unimaginable sacrifice.
And that sacrifice began the long, brutal process of recovery. The Civil War was not a straight shot to victory for the Union. It was a grinding, bloody conflict with huge swings in momentum.
Which brings us to the vocabulary of resolution and how we track those changes.
Right. When you're studying any large conflict, you need a way to gauge progress. You need a mechanism to see when things actually change. That mechanism is the turning point.
A great term. A turning point is defined as a specific time when a situation starts to change significantly, when it fundamentally alters the trajectory of events.
In war, it's when momentum shifts, definitively, from one side to the other.
And our sources identify the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863 as the unequivocal turning point of the American Civil War.
Before this battle, you could argue the war was swinging in the Confederacy's favor.
Oh, absolutely. The South had seen major victories. Robert E. Lee's army seemed almost invincible. They had made incursions into the North. There was a real sense of dread in Washington.
But Gettysburg changed all that. And the analysis of why it's a turning point goes far beyond just troop movements, doesn't it?
It does. Militarily, it was a catastrophe for the Confederacy. Lee's strategic offensive into Pennsylvania was completely crushed. It marked the high watermark, as they call it, the furthest they would ever get.
But the psychological shift was just as important.
Maybe more so. Lee's image of invincibility was shattered. The Southern public, which had been fed these narratives of inevitable victory, began to grasp the crushing material superiority and the defensive capability of the North. The hope started to dim.
There's a diplomatic angle here, too, which I think often gets overlooked.
A huge one. Before Gettysburg, European powers, especially Britain and France, were actively considering it. They were thinking about intervening, or at least recognizing the Confederacy as an independent nation.
Which would have been a disaster for the Union.
It could have ended the war. A decisive Confederate victory on Northern soil might have been the trigger for that recognition. But the sources highlight that the Union victory at Gettysburg, coupled with the fall of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River just days later,
The double blow.
a massive double blow, it proved to Europe that the Union was not going to collapse. Foreign intervention suddenly became politically impossible, diplomatically untenable.
So the turning point wasn't just a military victory.
Yeah.
It was a geopolitical confirmation that the Union was going to survive.
That's a perfect way to put it. The fighting would go on for 2 more brutal years, but the outcome was no longer in serious doubt.
Understanding a turning point helps us locate that exact moment where hope solidified into expectation. Before Gettysburg, the Union hoped to win. After, they expected to win.
even if the road was long. And that shift in momentum is what allowed Lincoln to pursue the ultimate resolution to the issue that had divided the House in the first place.
Which leads us to one of the most transformative words in this entire deep dive.
A truly colossal term: emancipation.
Emancipation. The definition is the process of being set free from legal, social, or political restrictions. It is, in a way, the final answer to secession and the House divided crisis.
It is.
And in this specific context, of course, we're talking about the Emancipation Proclamation, the document Lincoln signed on January 1st, 1863.
The sources correctly synthesize its ultimate meaning as simply freedom. But to truly understand its genius, we have to dive into the technical and strategic complexity of that document.
This is where we need to be really precise.
Yeah.
The proclamation was not a simple moral declaration that freed all enslaved people everywhere immediately.
It absolutely was not. It was a strategic military order. It was issued under the president's authority as commander-in-chief during a time of war. That's the key.
And that distinction is vital. It specifically applied only to enslaved people in states, or even parts of states, that were in active rebellion against the Union.
Right. And people ask, why was this limitation necessary? Why not just free everyone?
It seems counterintuitive.
It does, but Lincoln needed to maintain the loyalty of the 4 border states: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. They were slave states, but they had remained in the Union.
And freeing enslaved people there might have pushed them to secede.
It could have collapsed the entire Union war effort. The strategic position would have been untenable. So the proclamation was this masterpiece of moral principle fused with cold, hard military necessity.
And it fundamentally redefined the entire objective of the war.
Completely. Before 1863, the war was officially fought for one reason: to preserve the Union. That was the line.
But after the Emancipation Proclamation,
it became inextricably linked to ending slavery. It changed the legal status of enslaved people in the Confederacy from property to contraband of war.
which actively encouraged them to flee and join the Union cause.
Yes. And by doing so, it weakened the South's labor supply and, at the same time, swelled the ranks of the Union Army with hundreds of thousands of new soldiers, including former slaves.
So the sources say emancipation basically means freedom, and yes, it does. But the proclamation itself was the crucial legal mechanism that allowed the concept of freedom to be weaponized against the Confederacy.
It turned the South's greatest perceived asset, its enslaved population, into a decisive liability. And this act, moving from the divisive word secede to the unifying word emancipation, that shows the full spectrum of crisis and principled resolution.
And it demonstrates how that integrity, that self-educated wisdom Lincoln developed so early in his life, how it was absolutely essential for executing such a profoundly complex and ethically charged strategic shift right in the middle of a war.
The character forged on the frontier was now, finally, resolving the House divided. The arc is complete.
Okay, let's unpack this synthesis of knowledge. We've navigated the tumultuous era of the 1860s just by focusing on 6 essential, weighty concepts.
It's a powerful framework. We saw how the self-reliant nature of the frontier and that unwavering commitment to integrity created a leader who was prepared for crisis.
A leader honed by self-education. Then we explored the vocabulary of that crisis itself, the destructive political choice to secede.
Which confirmed the existential danger he had already articulated in the House divided metaphor.
And finally, we tracked the resolution. It was marked by the strategic shift of the turning point at Gettysburg.
And the moral and military power of emancipation.
Understanding these concepts, it gives you more than just a historical timeline. It provides a framework for analyzing how character intersects with crisis. It's a profound, shortcut understanding of Lincoln's era and really the principles that guide national stability.
And if we revisit the most human and maybe the most repeatable lesson we found in the source material, it all comes back to the power of self-education.
Yeah.
Lincoln became one of the greatest presidents in history by doing something accessible to everyone, reading complex texts, asking hard questions, and practicing logical thought.
You, the listener, are engaging in that same active process right now, just by dedicating your time to these deep dives. Intellectual perseverance truly is the most democratic path to knowledge.
It really is.
So if we connect this all back to the House divided concept, that chilling analysis of national vulnerability, it really raises a timeless question for reflection. Lincoln believed that a division over one fundamental issue, slavery, made the country unsustainable.
Right. So based on those principles of stability and vulnerability that Lincoln articulated so wisely, consider this. What is the single most profound division facing society today?
Whether it's political polarization, economic inequality, structural ideology.
Wherever you think it is.
Yeah.
What is that division that, if left unresolved, threatens the long-term stability and endurance of the collective house?
A truly provocative thought to close this chapter and to apply this historical wisdom. Thank you for joining us on this extensive deep dive.
Keep listening, keep reading, and never give up on the process of educating yourself. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking on, well, a true titan of history, Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely.
And our source material for this deep dive is, it's a little deceptive, actually. It's a simple collection of educational facts, some true, false questions, short answers.
The kind of thing you'd find in a history textbook.
Exactly. The absolute basic quiz points of his biography.
It's true. We're starting with what really amounts to the distilled knowledge of Lincoln's life, the answers you need to pass a test.
Right.
But our mission here is to use those answers as entry points. We are not just interested in what happened, but why those facts mattered and how they defined the monumental political challenge he was facing.
Yes, that's the key. We're moving beyond just a simple biography. I mean, we all know he was born in a log cabin, but what did that actually mean for his political viability in, say, 1850s America?
Right. What were the implications of that?
Or we know he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but what complex sort of calculated legal machinery did he have to deploy to even make that possible? The difference between knowing the fact and really understanding the implications of that fact, that's where the real knowledge is.
And the information we have, it's actually packaged pretty neatly for us. It falls into 3 key themes, which, helps us structure this whole analysis.
Okay.
First, you have his foundational reality, the gritty origins of his poverty and his self-driven path to an education.
The starting point.
Then second, his defining character, the political weight of his renowned integrity, his honesty.
Honest Abe.
That's the one. And then finally, the ultimate political legacy, his fight for freedom, and of course, the tragic, very abrupt end to his life.
That initial simple insight that a man born into just deep poverty could become president and save the Union, it really defines the scale of his achievement.
It does. He was not a figure of inherited wealth or institutional power. Not at all.
He was a self-made politician in an era that was, completely dominated by elites.
And if you look at the historical timeline, his political survival depended entirely on this one fact, that he was seen as an outsider, but an outsider who possessed, the highest possible degree of integrity.
That's a fascinating juxtaposition.
It is. That contrast between his common origins and this immense moral authority, that's what allowed him to command the respect he needed during a truly extraordinary national crisis.
Okay, let's unpack this. We really need to look at how that lack of privilege defined the man and really set the stage for his unique form of leadership. So let's start right at the beginning. Let's address the origins of Lincoln's life and how that struggle, molded his character. The first foundational true-false question in our source material asks if Lincoln was born into a wealthy or powerful family. And the answer is, of course, a resounding false.
And that simple negative, not wealthy, not powerful, is maybe the most powerful positive statement about his entire life.
Oh, so?
Well, the source material correctly identifies that he was born in a log cabin to a poor family. He had no wealth, no privilege. To really grasp this, you have to understand the American political landscape of the 19th century.
We tend to romanticize the log cabin, don't we?
Yeah.
But what does poor actually mean in that context? We're talking about Kentucky and Indiana frontier life. What does that mean for, access to power?
It means constant grinding physical labor and an immense socioeconomic contrast with everyone else in power. His contemporaries, the dominant Whigs and Democrats of the 1840s and 50s, these were often wealthy landholders, successful merchants, or, especially in the South, slave-holding plantation owners who represented these established political dynasties.
Their families had been in power for generations.
Exactly. Lincoln's rise was a profound disruption of this whole established order. When he entered politics, he was competing against figures like Henry Clay or the entire Southern aristocracy. These were men whose paths were paved for them by inherited wealth and education.
And so the implication of having no privilege isn't just about a lack of money. It's a complete lack of inherited social capital. No political connections.
None. His family could give him either a reputation or a seat at the table.
He had to earn it all himself.
Which forced him into a political strategy that was rooted in, authenticity and this relentless intellectual self-improvement.
Because that's all he had.
It was all he had. His worldview was forged by the sheer practicality of frontier life and the struggles of the common person. And this allowed him, years later, to connect with the average voter in a way that his more polished, aristocratic rivals just couldn't.
You can see it in his speeches, that plain style.
Absolutely. His plain, often humorous, rhetorical style was a direct result of that background. It made these incredibly complex issues accessible to everyone. It was, in the end, a political advantage that was rooted in a historical disadvantage.
So did his poverty shape his policies later on? I mean, did he use his background to advocate for programs that specifically benefited people from a similar background?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the policies enacted during his presidency that really had their origins in his frontier experience.
Right.
The push for internal improvements, better infrastructure, and crucially, the Homestead Act of 1862.
Which offered free land to Western settlers.
Right. These policies were designed to empower the small farmer, the laboring class, the very demographic he came from. He understood that prosperity required access to land and resources, not just connections.
So the foundational struggle of his career.
It became the foundation of his economic vision for the entire country.
That sets the stage perfectly for his character. Because, if you're going to gain trust without any inherited status, you need an unimpeachable personal reputation.
You have nothing else to stand on.
And the second true-false question in our sources addresses the weight of his famous nickname, Honest Abe. The answer, of course, is true. He was known for his integrity.
This is not just mythology. The core detail provided is that this honesty was built on decades of actions.
Right, from when he was working in a store or as a lawyer.
Exactly. We all know the famous anecdotes like him walking 6 miles to return a few pennies and change to a customer, or correcting a small error in a sales transaction. These small acts built a reputation that became his defining political asset.
Okay, but let's push back on that for a second. Wasn't Lincoln also known as a highly skilled, sometimes even ruthless politician? He was often criticized for being shrewd and manipulative, especially when he was dealing with rivals like his own Secretary of State, William Seward. So was Honest Abe just, skillful marketing?
That's a really crucial point of friction. And you're right, Lincoln was absolutely shrewd. You don't become president of the United States in the 1860s by being some sort of naive bumpkin from the frontier.
Right.
He was a master political chess player. However, the integrity, that Honest Abe moniker, it applied to his constitutional fidelity and his financial dealings. He was known for fulfilling his word and for respecting the law.
So the shrewdness was political maneuvering.
Yes. Managing cabinet rivals or, timing a legislative action perfectly. It wasn't personal deceit for personal gain. He used his reputation for integrity almost like a shield to allow him to deploy his political skill more effectively.
So the trust he earned from these small-town business dealings, that became the political currency he needed during the Civil War. Why did that trust matter so much during a time of, total national collapse?
Because integrity during an existential crisis functions as the necessary foundation for unity. The war wasn't universally popular in the North.
Not at all.
And Lincoln faced immense opposition. You had Copperhead Democrats who wanted peace at any price, abolitionists who thought he was moving too slowly, radicals who thought he moved too quickly.
A tough crowd.
Incredibly tough. So to prosecute a war that required drafting citizens, raising taxes, and even suspending certain civil liberties like habeas corpus, the commander-in-chief needed the public to have profound trust in his motivations.
If he had been seen as just another opportunistic politician, those border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, they were slave states, but they stayed in the Union.
They would have been gone in an instant.
And that could have been the end of the Union right there.
Precisely. His reputation ensured that when he made an unpopular decision, like firing a major general or issuing a controversial order, the public consensus was, well, he must be doing this for the good of the Union, not for himself.
He was arguing for constitutional fidelity on a national scale.
And it was backed up by a personal reputation for fidelity on a local scale. This raises a really important question. Could Stephen Douglas or any of his other contemporaries who lacked that same bedrock of personal trust have survived the relentless political and military setbacks of 1861 and 1862?
It seems very unlikely. Probably not. Their authority would have been constantly undermined. Lincoln's character became, a strategic prerequisite for his ability to lead the war.
It was.
It allowed him to focus on the impossible military tasks instead of constantly having to defend his own ethics.
And that character was forged not in an elite college, not in a fancy law firm, but through relentless effort, which brings us to the astonishing fact of his self-education.
Right. So moving from character to capability, we have to examine how Lincoln acquired the deep knowledge, especially the legal and constitutional knowledge, that he needed to issue the defining documents of his presidency. The source material asks a simple question. How did Lincoln get educated if there were no schools nearby?
And the answer is just pure self-reliance and this incredible intellectual hunger. The core detail is that he was self-educated.
Borrowing books from neighbors, reading them by the firelight.
Teaching herself law and history. And this wasn't just, a quaint hobby. This was an intensely rigorous, almost obsessive path to knowledge.
I want to focus on the specific content of this self-education for a moment. What was he actually reading? It's hard to imagine teaching yourself something as complex as law outside of a structured environment.
It is. But he was a ferocious reader of a few key foundational texts. His main legal source was Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England.
Which was the standard at the time.
It was the comprehensive guide to Anglo-American law. But he didn't just read it. He internalized it. He linked it directly to the U.S. Constitution and to various statutes.
And for history?
For history, he devoured biographies of the Founding Fathers, studying the origins of the Union itself. But beyond that, he also mastered geometry and logic.
Geometry. That's interesting.
Yes, and it's key. Those disciplines taught him the rigorous deductive reasoning that came to define his later speeches and his legal arguments.
That explains his rhetorical style, doesn't it? His speeches, like the Gettysburg Address, they're famous for their clarity, their precision. It's almost like a geometric logic, building an argument step by step.
He applied the rigor of geometry to law and politics. That's a perfect way to put it.
So he's applying this mathematical rigor to his political thinking.
Exactly. And when you teach yourself law, you develop a relationship with the text that is based on meticulous interpretation, not just on, inherited doctrine from a professor.
He had figured out for himself.
And that independent understanding of the Constitution was absolutely crucial when the country started arguing over the legality of its own existence. He knew the limits and the inherent ambiguities of the founding documents because he had painstakingly taught them to himself. He basically became his own legal institution.
And this constitutional grounding it was absolutely necessary for the greatest policy decision of his life.
Without a doubt.
So let's transition now to the application of that self-acquired knowledge. Short answer question 5 asks, what document did he sign to free the slaves in the South? The core detail is simple. The Emancipation Proclamation.
The name is simple, yes, but the document itself is a legal marvel and a political tightrope walk. We have to analyze it not just as a moral declaration, but as a strategic use of wartime executive power. This is him directly applying his self-taught legal theory.
Okay, so the proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, it famously declared freedom only for slaves in the states that were in rebellion against the Union. Why the limitation? I mean, why not just free all slaves everywhere?
Because legally he couldn't. His legal power stemmed from his role as commander-in-chief during a time of war.
Right.
He could not unilaterally change the Constitution or override the civil laws of the loyal border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. To even attempt that would have been an illegal action, guaranteed to be struck down by the courts.
And it would have instantly alienated those border states.
Instantly. They would have likely joined the Confederacy, and the war would have been lost.
So he used the war itself as the necessary legal loophole. He classified enslaved people in the Confederacy as contraband of war, basically enemy resources that he could seize and then free to weaken the opposing side.
That is the core legal mechanism. He justified it under the doctrine of military necessity, leaning on precedents like the Confiscation Acts that Congress had already passed.
And strategically, this served 2 immediate purposes.
2 huge purposes. First, it physically weakened the Confederate war machine by eliminating its labor base. And second, and this is perhaps even more important, it allowed for 180,000 black men to join the Union Army and Navy.
Which provided vital manpower at a critical time.
Absolutely vital.
And on the global stage, as we touched on earlier, it was a diplomatic masterstroke.
It was decisive. Before 1863, Britain and France were often debating whether to recognize the Confederacy, mainly to secure their cotton supplies.
Right.
By explicitly making the war about the abolition of slavery, this moral objective, Lincoln made it impossible for any European power to support the Confederacy without looking like complete hypocrites, given their own abolitionist movements.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture,
The proclamation permanently changed the identity of the Union cause. It transformed it from a fight merely for preservation into a crusade for human liberty.
but, and historians are always quick to point this out, because the Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime measure based on executive power, it wasn't permanent constitutional law, it was, in effect, a temporary decree.
That is absolutely essential context for our learner to understand. The proclamation freed the slaves, yes, but that freedom was dependent on the Union Army being there to enforce it, and the legal status was shaky at best.
And Lincoln knew this.
He recognized this profound limitation himself, and that is why he dedicated himself entirely, following the issuance of the proclamation, to pushing for the 13th Amendment.
Which permanently and constitutionally abolished slavery throughout the entire United States.
The proclamation was the necessary military step. The 13th Amendment was the necessary constitutional conclusion. The final abolition of slavery required the political weight and the legal rigor that he had spent his entire life acquiring.
It's just a remarkable demonstration of how self-acquired knowledge translated into world-changing policy, all of it executed under immense, unrelenting military pressure. So we tracked Lincoln through his ascent, his self-education, and his defining executive action. Now we turn to the final act, the tragic conclusion and the enduring philosophical power of his words. And we start with true-false question 3. Did Lincoln live to see a long era of peace after the Civil War ended? And the answer is just tragically false.
The detail here is just so stark and terrible. Lincoln was assassinated just 5 days after the war ended. 5 days.
5 days between victory and his death.
This 5-day shadow, as it's sometimes called, fundamentally altered the course of American history.
Just 5 days. He never saw the peace he fought for, and the nation was instantly thrust right back into political turmoil. If we analyze the implications of that timing, what was the primary thing that was lost in terms of leadership capacity right at that moment?
The nation lost the one figure who possessed the political capital, the moral authority, and the personal temperament required to lead the difficult, painful process of Reconstruction.
It's one thing to fight a war, another thing to build a peace.
A vast difference. Fighting requires force. Securing the peace requires statesmanship, reconciliation, and often forgiveness. Lincoln had already outlined a moderate approach to this, the 10% plan. It was based on a swift re-entry of former Confederate states with, minimal punitive measures. His vision was explicitly laid out in his second inaugural address, with malice toward none, with charity for all.
A policy that was really rooted in his own character of integrity and reconciliation.
Yes, and his assassination created a sudden and dangerous power vacuum. Leadership immediately fell to Vice President Andrew Johnson, a man who was just fundamentally ill-equipped for the task.
He was a Tennessee war Democrat, right? Not really aligned with the Republicans.
Not at all. He'd never fully aligned with the Republican Party or its ideals of racial equality. He was politically inept, and he lacked Lincoln's ability to negotiate with Congress, especially with the powerful faction known as the Radical Republican.
Led by men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner.
Exactly. So, without Lincoln's steady hand, the conflict just moved from the battlefield to Capitol Hill. It essentially became a bitter legislative war.
A completely different kind of battle.
Precisely. The moderate, unifying Reconstruction that Lincoln had envisioned was replaced by this chaotic battle between Johnson, who favored a quick, easy return to state rule by white Southerners,
and the Radical Republicans, who demanded fundamental changes to Southern society, legal protections, and eventually suffrage for black men.
And Johnson's incompetence and his deep-seated racism led directly to these huge political clashes, his impeachment trial, and years of devastatingly chaotic Reconstruction policies that, in the end, failed to secure lasting civil rights for black citizens in the South.
Which just set the stage for decades of Jim Crow laws.
It did. The tragedy of those 5 days is that the peace he fought for was immediately undermined by political violence and division, just when unity was most critical. His absence is arguably one of the most consequential events in all of American history.
It really is the ultimate what if.
It is. If he had lived, his integrity and his political skill might have forced a compromise between the North and South, between the executive and Congress. He might have been able to stabilize Reconstruction and fundamentally change the long-term racial and political map of the United States.
His life demonstrated the power of unity.
And his death demonstrated the destructive force of division.
And it is through his enduring words that we get the most insight into the philosophy he would have applied to that healing process. So now we can look at the philosophical anchors, the words used for the shadowing practice in our sources, which are really the distillation of his entire political life. The first of these powerful phrases from the Gettysburg Address is government of the people, by the people, for the people.
This is so much more than a slogan. It's a structural analysis of democracy itself. We can actually deconstruct this phrase by looking at those three prepositions.
Okay.
Of the people addresses the source of sovereignty. In a republic, authority doesn't flow down from a monarch or a military. It originates from the mass of citizens.
So the power comes from us, basically.
Exactly. Then you have by the people, which addresses the mechanism of power. This requires citizen participation elections, civic engagement, voting to actually run the government. It demands active citizenship, not passive obedience.
You have to be involved.
You have to be. And finally, for the people defines the purpose and beneficiary of governance. The ultimate moral test of any political system is whether its actions serve the collective welfare of its citizens, not the self-interest of those in power.
And to think he articulated this concise definition at Gettysburg, standing on a field just saturated with blood.
Yes, reminding the nation that the sacrifices that were made were to preserve this precise ideal, the survival of a democratic experiment that valued self-rule above all else. It is a philosophical anchor for any democratic project anywhere in the world.
The second quote speaks directly to the crisis he spent his entire presidency trying to resolve. A house divided against itself cannot stand.
This quote, which he uttered in 1858 during his famous debates with Stephen Douglas, has deep theological and political resonance. It references a biblical saying, of course, but Lincoln applied it explicitly to the slavery crisis.
And in its original context.
In its original context, he was arguing that the nation could not permanently exist with these fundamentally conflicting moral and legal systems, one dedicated to freedom, the other reliant on human bondage.
And what's so fascinating here is that his political opponents criticized him for that statement. They said he was being too radical, that he was trying to force a kind of unity where compromise was still possible.
That's absolutely true. Douglas argued that Americans could endure as a divided house through the concept of popular sovereignty, just let each state decide for itself on slavery.
But Lincoln's point was that this wasn't some minor policy disagreement.
No. Lincoln argued that the moral and legal contradiction was so deep, so essential to the nation's character, that it would inevitably tear the system apart. And he was right. Within 3 years, the House literally divided, leading to the Civil War. The statement became tragically self-fulfilling.
So beyond the context of 1858, what is the lasting warning this quote provides for us today?
I think it serves as a permanent warning about the danger of internal ideological fracture on core constitutional or moral issues. It's a caution against allowing deep, irreconcilable divisions to fester at the heart of the national project.
Whether it's a family, a business, or a nation.
The concept is constant. If the foundational purpose or moral agreement is lost, the entire structure becomes brittle and vulnerable to collapse. These quotes, learned through practice, are foundational texts on political sustainability and integrity. #outro.
So what does this deep dive into these foundational facts about Abraham Lincoln mean for you, the learner? I mean, we've traced this remarkable self-made trajectory from genuine frontier poverty through intense self-taught legal scholarship to acquiring the moral and strategic authority to fundamentally reshape the Constitution with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Only to be assassinated just 5 days after achieving the peace he fought for.
It's just an incredible story.
The synthesis of all these details, it really reinforces a fundamental political truth. That extraordinary historical challenges demand extraordinary and often self-forged character.
Right.
Lincoln's legacy is defined by the depth of his character, the integrity that allowed him to command trust, and the commensurate depth of his struggle, the poverty, the war, and his violent end.
His life really demonstrates that profound, necessary change can be executed by someone who rises from the absolute bottom, armed only with self-knowledge, legal rigor, and moral purpose.
I think so.
So the source material suggested connections to other figures of immense historical achievement, like Nelson Mandela or Marie Curie, and the common thread there is clear.
It is. These were all people who faced immense structural barriers, whether it was poverty and institutional exclusion, political oppression, or, institutional bias in science.
And they achieved world-changing ends because Their personal integrity and their intellectual dedication forced historical change against powerful resistance.
They are all powerful models of resilience, where personal character becomes the irreplaceable engine for historical advancement. They achieve profound good, not from positions of initial structural strength, but by pushing through resistance, political, social, or scientific, that the established order tried to place in their way.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you process this deep dive.
Okay.
We established that Lincoln was assassinated mere days after the Civil War concluded.
Leaving the difficult era of Reconstruction to his ill-suited successor, Andrew Johnson.
And we saw how Johnson's lack of political skill and moral authority led to legislative chaos, bitter impeachment proceedings, and a failed opportunity for genuine national reconciliation.
Ultimately contributing to a century of racial strife.
So here's the thought. If Lincoln had survived the attack and used his unique moral authority and strategic compassion, that commitment to government of the people, by the people, for the people, how might his presence have redefined that entire Reconstruction era?
That's the question. Would his steady hand have averted the destructive clashes between the executive and the radical Congress?
And fundamentally put the South on a different path of integration and cooperation? Would Lincoln's survival have averted decades of painful American history?
Think about the weight of those 5 days and the irreplaceable value of character in moments of profound political transition as you continue your own learning journey.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.